Hey everyone, welcome back to our channel. If you're new here, please subscribe. I'd really love that. If you're returning, how are you today? In today's video, we're going to continue with We Had Everything But Money, okay? The Great Depression was tightening its grip. Our local banks were closing. Family members and friends were coming home from work to say they wouldn't be going back tomorrow. This was no mere recession. It was a disaster. I was fresh out of college and job hunting was futile. No help wanted. Signs hung in employment offices. My friend Jerry Edlund had been laid off, so we decided our best bet would be to make our own jobs. By doing what? Companies were failing everywhere, and what could a couple of green kids do? Jerry's father had a suggestion. He was a financial reporter who'd been laid off himself, and his territory had included Chicago's Great South Water Street wholesale produce market. "Why don't you boys try selling fruits and vegetables?" Pa asked. "I've been doing great reports on the big wholesalers for years, and I know them pretty well. I can introduce you, and I'm sure they'll give you some tips. They're always looking for new customers." Over the next 2 weeks, we acquired an old Model T Ford truck, painted our names on the door, and scraped up enough money to buy a load of produce. Our first day in business was quite an adventure. About 3:30 on a freezing November morning, I cranked up the truck, joined Jerry and Pa in the cab, and headed for the bustling market. The open stalls displayed more fruits and vegetables than we had ever seen. Trucks of all descriptions were parked down the middle of the road, the street, as the drivers went from stall to stall, checking the produce and haggling over the prices. Pa made introductions for us, and we made our purchases. Back home, we washed and trimmed everything to make it as attractive as possible. Then we spruced ourselves up and set out to visit the housewives of the community. It had been a long time since our neighborhood had an old-fashioned peddler. The novelty, convenience, and high-quality produce combined for a surprisingly favorable reaction. On subsequent buying trips, we scoured the market with Pa for the best produce we could find. We started checking supermarket prices and set our slightly lower. It was quite some time before we realized we were selling deluxe produce, which ordinarily went to the finest hotels and restaurants at our chain store prices. Our customers were enthusiastic. None had ever heard of broccoli, and few knew about avocados, Michigan hearts of celery, or Temple oranges. Profits were slim, but our business was thriving. Our schedule was rigorous. We rose at 3:30, shivering as we cranked up the truck. Then we drove to the market for our usual session of bargaining. We returned home as the sun began chasing the morning mists. Our wives, Ginny and Peg, helped us trim and sort what we'd bought. By 9 a.m., we were back on the street, knocking on doors, smiling, displaying our baskets, and making sales. By 4 p.m., we rolled down the truck's canvas sides and headed for home. We climbed 1,000 apartment building steps and trudged through hundreds of backyards and lugged a 1/4 ton of food into the townspeople's larders. One evening, our wives told us they wanted to go along with us to the market the next morning. "No way," Jerry and I replied. "The market is no place for girls." Our wives argued that they were part of the business too, but Jerry and I didn't budge. The market was a very rough place. The next morning, we were about halfway to the market when we heard muffled giggles from the back of the truck. We pulled over to investigate, and out popped our wives. Surprise! They shouted triumphantly. We were surprised, and at that point we had no choice but to take them along. We were even more surprised when we discovered the effect that two attractive young women had on the gruff workers at the market. Ginny and Peg were greeted warmly, shown around, given little gifts of special fruit, and generally treated like visiting royalty. When we headed back home, Jerry and I took a lot of teasing about how tough the market really was. The little Charlton Edlin Company became an unforgettable chapter in our lives. Although it didn't develop into an empire, it brought in a few precious dollars, put food on the table for two families, and gave us all a little more confidence. We knew we could cope with whatever life brought us in the years to come. The Thread Man came to our neighborhood 4 times a year during the early 1930s. He stopped at each house on our street, rang the bell, knelt to display his wares to the housewife who answered the door, and waited for a decision. The visits on our short street along took an hour out of his day, and he made few sales. His black case contained sewing notions, each held neatly in place with an elastic band. Boxes of thread and pins, needles, cards of shirt buttons, safety pins for diapers, silver hooks and eyes, black snaps and blue cards and shoelaces. He handed those simple wares as though they were fine jewels. When a customer closed the door, he carefully returned each item to its proper place and moved on to the next house. Our mother admired the Thread Man. Whenever we called Thread Man's coming, she'd drop whatever she was doing and make a quick inventory of her sewing supplies. She always bought something, whether she needed it or not. He has dignity, she said. He's neat and clean, and he tries. Mother thought he must have held a fine position before the stock market crashed. I can tell from his clothes, the good white shirt, that blue serge suit, the coat with the velvet collar. They're old, but good quality. It was true the Thread Man was much neater than other peddlers who came to our door. He wore black derby in the winter, and black galoshes over polished shoes when it was damp. In summer, he tipped his neat straw hat to all females, slightly inclining his graying head. Mother also was impressed by the regularity of his schedule. He walks the rounds like it's a good job, she said. He gets dressed in his best clothes and goes to work. I like him. At each visit, Mother continued to increase her supply of notions, scanning the case's contents with her hand on her cheek, and then taking the required coin from her apron pocket. The Thread Man graciously thanked her. One day during the spring thaw, the Thread Man spotted my little sister stuck in the mud in the vacant lot at the end of the block. After carefully placing his black case on the sidewalk, he waded into the muck, dirtying his boots and trousers, then waded back out with a crying child under one arm. Mother was surprised to find them at the back door and invited him in to clean up. After a little brushing and scraping, a shoe shine, and a cup of tea, the Thread Man was on his way. Such a gentleman, Mother said. That summer the Thread Man visited us once more, and Mother offered him a glass of iced tea and brought another spool of white thread. As he left, my little sister rode her tricycle on the sidewalk alongside of him. Goodbye, you old stick in the mud, he teased her, gently patting her curls. Goodbye, Thread Man, she called after him. It was the last time we ever saw him. Helen Uberbacher, Stamford, Connecticut. During the Depression, many people couldn't even pay taxes on their homes, let alone their mortgage. We had a big rambling house in town, and there were 4 children with twins on the way. Although we were losing our house, my mother was determined not to give in. I have an idea, she told us. If I can get it working, we'll have a house again. She went to a neighbor who owned several pieces of property and asked him about a big brick house. on the main thoroughfare. He asked how we expected to pay the rent. Mom said she had no money, but if he would trust her, she'd have it by the end of the month. She intended to open a tourist home. I know it will work. With all of the salesmen that pass through here, Mother told him, and it's just down the street from the train station. The owner was impressed with the idea, and we had a new home. My father made a wooden sign with lights on either side and hung it on the veranda. The rest of us scrubbed and cleaned to get the house ready for visitors. Mom charged 50 cents a night for rooms and $7 a week for room and board, with laundry included. There were some hard times when no one came, but Mom would always say the Lord will send someone. Sure enough, there soon would be a knock at the door and someone would want a room. One night, a man came to the door and asked Mom could put up his telephone crew of 10. You should have seen her face. Room and board for 10 men? It was a miracle. We saw some interesting characters, but most of our guests were people just like my parents. Some had lost everything and didn't want to give up, and were on the road trying to make a few cents and send some home to their families. It was hard work, and everyone in the family had chores to do, but we were happy. In later years, Mom bought that house, and then another. That's what determination gets you. Never say die, Mom would say. Hard work never hurt anybody. When the banks closed, my father lost his savings overnight. In another 8 months, he had to close what had been a prosperous furniture and antique storage warehouse. But he was young and strong, with plenty of imagination. He decided to become an auctioneer. Dad would buy stocks of merchandise from failing businesses, hold an auction, pay the owner his share of the profits, and then move whatever was left over to a store he rented for $15 a month on South Broadway in Yonkers, New York. He called the store the Broadway Bazaar, where a shopper could buy anything from a lace-up corset to a spool of thread. Although those were lean years, Dad's business provided many items our family could use. He didn't have store-bought shoes for years. We just waited until Dad bought out a shoe store stock and hoped there would be some to fit us. Most were usually too big for me, but I could wear them with a little paper tucked by the toes. Whenever Dad bought out a toy store, my doll collection grew. I discovered bonbons when he bought out a candy store. A bookstore purchase gave me my own set of poetry volumes, bound in blue leather. One year, my aunts and cousins and I got silk pajamas with Chinese lettering embroidered on the jackets. My mother was feeding us on $1 a day then, so we were all pleased when my father bought a grocery store that had sustained a fire. He brought home boxes of canned goods whose labels had been washed off by the firemen's hoses. Every night at dinner, we'd gather around the table to try and guess what was in the cans, watching with great anticipation at the contents that were revealed. It was usually beans, fruit cocktail, or soup, but that didn't matter. It was food. Somehow, those same foods don't taste nearly as good now as they did then. Carol Greenberg, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I was practicing recycling a half-century before it was fashionable, and making money at it too. As a young boy in a small village in central Michigan, I collected many different types of bottles and sold them. For instance, early on in the Depression, when prohibition was still the law of the land, I looked for empty whiskey bottles and clandestine nippers would leave behind the old dance hall. I'd go at daybreak every Sunday and would sell the bottles to local bootleggers for 5 cents each. He paid me a premium of 10 cents for one special bottle with deep, intricate etchings. This bottle undoubtedly came from the days when whiskey had been legal, and I retrieved and resold it week after week. Most of the Saturday night nippers always drank in the same hidden location, so I knew where to find those empties. Some were more brazen and left their bottles in plain view on the dance hall's outside window ledges. It was like plucking nickels off the sills as I walked by. This part of my bottle business took no more than 20 minutes and brought in about $1.50 a week. Not bad when $2 was the going rate for a day's labor. Medicine bottles from trash piles in the village dump provided ready cash too. I washed the reclaimed bottles in boiling water and then delivered them to the veterinarian. My heart would pound as he divided the bottles into 3 groups. A very small bottle brought in a penny. Medium-sized ones, 3 cents. Large ones, a nickel. I also liked doing business with the old horse doctor because he usually gave me a little something extra for my trouble. One day, though, I was disappointed when his tip turned out to be a shot for my dog, who had tagged along. I didn't even know dogs needed shots. I would have much preferred an extra dime. While I searched for medicine bottles, I also put aside a small pickle and olive jars for special once-a-year venture, selling horseradish. I'd come upon a horseradish patch on an abandoned farm north of town, and I knew that once a year my father splurged and bought a jar of the stuff. I reasoned there must be others who could part with a dime for a jar of fresh grated horseradish too, and I was right. My bottle business taught me at a very early age that imagination, hustle, and hard work paid pretty good dividends. The Depression was at its peak, and my husband, building supply salesman, had just lost his 3rd job as yet another company had folded. Our thoughts for the future were not hopeful. One day I was baking a pan of chocolate tarts, and when I pulled them from the oven, my mother remarked, "I'll just bet there are many people who would like one of those." Although I'm not naturally an impulsive person, I said, "Well, I think I'll find out." I filled a basket with the tarts and went over to a house in the next block. Fortunately, it was the home of a chocoholic, and she bought all of my tarts. I was so overcome by the sale that when I got home, I made out a shopping list and went to the grocery store so I could bake again the next day. I soon worked up quite a little business making cupcakes and tarts and cookies, donuts and pies to order. My husband was unsuccessful in finding another job, so he became my delivery man. Our 5-year-old daughter went along with her own little basket of goodies. We were able to survive on this income for some time, but we just couldn't pay our rent. We put everything into storage and found a 2-room apartment in our private home. My husband found 3 part-time jobs after that, and the good times finally came again. Irene Baldwin, Arlington, Virginia. In 1933, we were still in the throes of the Depression, and I had 3 small children, and my husband, a printer, was developing arthritis in his fingers. When he was able to work, he made $12 a week. I'd always done whatever I could do to add to the family income, most sewing, painting, but now it had become necessary for me to do more, so I put in longer hours. When I could, I left the children with my husband and painted murals in the houses of those who could afford the cost, which was $3 to $5. Some of those paintings are still on the walls today. I also made fancy cakes and pies and did more sewing. Dress materials were 17 cents a yard, and I was paid 25 cents for making a woman's dress, and twice that for a two-piece garment. Our rent was $10 a month, and even with the extra work I was doing, there were some months we just couldn't pay all of it. Our fine landlord told us just to pay a quarter at a time as we got it. He always seemed to find something I could do, such as cleaning one of his buildings, or to earn the extra additional amount needed to pay that rent. Food prices were high, too, compared to our wages. Milk was 8 cents a quart, bread 10 cents a loaf, and eggs 7 cents a dozen. My little ones never did understand why Mama didn't like the bread they thought was so wonderful. One day I was sewing. I heard a vehicle stop by the garage. When no one came to the house, I laid my sewing aside and opened the door. There on the porch sat a big box of groceries, with the name of the store printed on the side of the box. I knew the delivery wasn't mine. It must have been left at our house by mistake, and someone else would be waiting for it. How I longed to be able to provide such abundance for my own family. With a heavy heart, I loaded the box into our little homemade wagon and pulled it to the grocery store. When I told the owner what had happened, he said, "Did you look in the bags?" "Of course I didn't," I exclaimed. "I had no right to do that." He reached into one of the bags and pulled out a note and handed it to me. I'll never forget these words. "I admire your quiet willingness to do anything that is decent and honest, to care for your family without complaint. Please accept this small gift from a friend and well-wisher." She asked me to deliver it to you and keep her identity a secret, the grocer told me. The groceries were worth $5, nearly half a week's wages at the print shop. It was one of the most wonderful things anyone had ever done for me. Wow. It's amazing, isn't it? Simply amazing. Okay, now, a subscriber had sent this to me, and she says, "After listening to you read from the book for the last few days, I thought you might be interested in my mother's story of her young life as she was just a young child during the Depression." So I'm going to read this to you, okay? My early years during the Great Depression. My parents were raised in the mountains of Northern California and Southern Oregon. In the early part of the 20th century, life even before the Depression was harsh in this area, from snow falling feet deep during the winters and summers reaching into the 100 teens during the summer. But the people were honest, hard-working folk. So when the Depression came, they just continued as life was normal. My parents married in 1932, as the Depression was in full swing. My dad worked for the California Conservative Corp and learned to operate a cat skinner, today what we call a bulldozer. After his training was finished, he got a job with Southern Pacific Railroad, preparing the land for new tracks to be laid. He was given what was called a family car. Essentially, it was an empty box car he could turn into a home. So he spent all of his free time preparing the family car to be a home for his small family. He put up internal walls to create a living space of 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, living area, and a bathroom. He built and installed a water tank to the roof of the family car, piped it down to the kitchen and bathroom. In the kitchen, the pipes were run through the wood cook stove to the kitchen sink. Underneath the family car, he had built another tank and installed it under the toilet. This tank he would empty when the family car was not moving down the tracks. Of course, for these times, this was high living to have hot water and a flushing toilet. Once the family car was ready, life became one stop after another on the tracks. Dad would leave early in the morning with the rest of the crew on a train going down the tracks to where they were building a new track, and at the end of the day the train would return with the men. Of course, due to the type of house and nature of the job, sometimes the family house would move down the tracks. Many times I would come home from school. Mind you, at this time I was all of 5 to 8 years of age. I would find the laundry laying on the ground, the wash buckets still on the tree stump waiting to be used, or chairs still sitting where Mom had left them just outside the door to the family car, floor rugs that were being beaten on the ground with the rope that was tied from a tree to the family car, even the dog being left behind as the family car was moved to the next stop location on the tracks. I would have to gather whatever it was that got left behind, find out which direction down the track the family cars were taken, and walk down the track to the next stop of the family cars to find home. Some days it was a 2-mile walk, some days just a mile, but it was always an adventure to come home from school to find you had moved. School was not easy to attend for us kids with parents working on the rails. School was either farther away or the house was moved farther away from the school on any given day. We got to know hobos and bums, train engineers, and Southern Pacific Railroad employees. We learned to hunt and fish and garden on a small platform Dad built to make a garden bed on. The families on the tracks were just like everyone else. Our house just moved at least once a week, which made exploring as a child that much more interesting. There was always something new to see. After 4 years of living on the rails this way, my mom and dad had saved enough money to buy a small farm in southern Oregon. That's amazing. I absolutely love that story. Thank you for sharing. Okay, guys, that's all for this video. I love you. I'll see you in the next one. Stay safe. Stay positive. Keep prepping. And as always,